So, Peter, welcome to the Suspicious Transaction Report.
Thank you very much for having me on, Tom.
Well, it's a pleasure. I've been trying to get hold of you for a long time. So let's start. You spend a lot of time studying the whole question of kind of political funding and so on. There's a term you use in your writing, which is dark money. So just unpack that for us to begin with.
Yeah, and the phrase dark money, it's been used a lot in the States for a long time. I think it's kind of synonymous with Jane Meyer, the wonderful New Yorker writer who wrote the book of the same name, Dark Money. And essentially it means any money that gets into the political process that we can't see. Any money that you can't see where it's come from. And I use that term a lot in my book. Sometimes it means political donations that you can't see. Often it can be other things. It can be money that go to think tanks that are influential, but you don't know where their money comes from. It could be things like Facebook advertisements that appear and there's a name attached to them, but that's clearly not the person who's bought the ad. So it's kind of like looking at that idea of how you can influence the political system using money, because you really need money to do much political influence, but using it in ways that we can't see.
So before we dive into some specific examples, in particular from your book, but also the reporting you've done more recently, I mean, where are the kind of generically speaking vulnerabilities in the system? Yes, you need money to run political campaigns, but how can money open up opportunity?
Well, you can see, well, effectively, there's a couple of spaces in particular. One is that it's around the cost of doing business, the cost of politics it's higher than the amount of money that's there to do it. We all know this. There's a cost more to run an election campaign than most parties can fundraise. So there's a space there that opens up. We don't have a massive culture of giving donations, small donations to political parties. So often political parties either have to raise them from corporate donors, from rich individuals, or in the case, particularly in the UK of the Labour Party, the unions give a lot of money to political parties. So that's a space there. There's a bit where, especially when it comes to individual candidates as well, because individual candidates often have to raise their own money to try and run. So the central party will give them a certain amount of money, but if a candidate wants more money, wants to do more, then they need more money, and that's often a space where donations can become really important. But it's not just, I think, around, we can focus on elections. I think elections are obviously really important. The digital age has also changed that. It gives you more opportunity to become, especially for bad actors, to get involved online in digital space in ways that are really hard to see. But there's also that kind of rolling nature of political life. There's opportunities. Anytime I think there's an opportunity to influence politics, to influence politicians, money can play a role. And actually often not having to disclose where that money comes from can actually be very useful. Because once you know where money comes from, that can become a talking point. Where does that money come from? Who is that? And that can become an issue. And you see that with politicians. Every 4 months or every 3 months, the Electoral Commission announces its quarterly returns. You'll see who the biggest donors are. That'll be a couple of days of headlines in pretty much every newspaper. If there's a controversial donor, the leader of the party, if it's Keir Starmer, Rishi Sunak, whoever, will be asked questions about it. If you can take that bit out of it, it's very useful. It allows you to have a lot more flexibility, a lot more opportunity to influence without having to answer that question.
So when I think about money and politics, I think of like the kind of razzmatazz, the big fundraisings that happen in the United States, where it's a billion-dollar industry. In the UK, the numbers you see reported are paltry. I remember the expenses scandal. We got worked up over £5,000 here or there. The same when we talk about political financing in the UK. But I think your contention is that actually a small amount of money goes a long way in the UK, and we should really care about that. Is that right?
It's very much, I think it is, and it's interesting. One example that story in about 2020 was Robert Jenrick, who was at the time I think a Treasury Minister. He was in the planning department, and he had overruled a decision by the Tower Hamlets local authority and the government's own planning inspectorate to do this big development, the Westbury development in the Isle of Dogs here in London. And in overruling them, he'd basically saved Richard Desmond, who's a Conservative donor, as well as a former porn baron as well. He made a lot of his money in pornography. It saved him an estimated £45 million in potential tax on this. And it quickly became apparent in news reporting and others that Jenrick had been lobbied by Richard Desmond. They'd sat beside each other at a Conservative Party fundraiser. Richard Desmond had showed Robert Jenrick a video of this development on his phone, showed him how great it was. Robert Jenrick later admitted actually apparent bias in his decision, although he didn't resign. And what was really interesting about that was it cost Richard Desmond £12,000 to be at that fundraiser, to buy a table at this fundraiser, to get to sit next to the minister. And I think that gives some idea that like a small amount of money can be really, really effective. It can put you in a place where you're sitting next to a government minister and able to lobby on their behalf. And we see this continually, actually, where often what look like quite small amounts of money can be quite influential. So you mentioned about America. In the UK, David Cameron, when he was the Conservative leader, brought in this thing called the Leaders Club. So the Leaders Club are top Tory donors who get to meet, have off-the-record meetings with the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers once a quarter. And they have dinner and they get to chat about stuff. Now, so if you're thinking about somewhere like America, what would it take to be on the leaders group? You know, say you're President Biden or future President Trump, you know, you'd be talking tens of millions of pounds, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. In the United Kingdom, it was £50,000 a year got you this kind of access, which I think to a lot of people is quite remarkable. Like, not that £50,000 isn't a significant amount of money. It is, but if you're very rich, it isn't. And I was really struck looking at the Times Rich List, which comes out every year, and I'm always interested in it. And it came out not too long ago. And the number of political donors, I was flicking page by page. I'm not a business reporter, but I knew almost all of the names. And I knew almost all the names because I'd seen them in Electoral Commission returns or I'd written stories about them.
Yes, it's a very, cause yeah, maybe we should set up a crowdfunding and we should raise the 50 grand and perhaps we can go and join that club. Why not? I mean, we give them 50 grand, they should let us in. Now, yeah, we can joke about this, and your example you gave there was a kind of a planning related example. But of course, we live in an era where state threats and the intervention of hostile states is of much greater concern. So how do you sort of see this potentially playing out in this new kind of geopolitically fragmented world?
I think this is a big aspect of it. We had this the kind of the Russia report, which became a bit of a cause célèbre. This idea of the intelligence select committee, security intelligence select committee's report into Russian involvement in British politics in general and British political life, which took it was essentially sat on for a long period of time by Boris Johnson, eventually published, and it made a lot of warnings that are incredibly prescient now, about 4 years after its publication, about the potential role of malign actors, of Russia and other malign actors in British political life, both through the influence on politicians, and we've seen some of that. There's been reporting, say, of members of the House of Lords on trips to Russia, members of the House of Lords at kind of pro-Russian events in the UK. So there is spaces there for people who are legislators. We've had scandals in the past about MPs and trips and the kind of the ability for influence through legislators. But there's also the kind of greater ability to kind of feed polarization, to kind of feed into narratives around the political narratives, and also to feed fringe parties that can actually be very effective at, in a 24/7 media environment, really kind of shaking things up, inverted commas, and creating all sorts of, kind of quite divisive narratives that can really affect what a political system looks like. And we saw that from the Trump election in 2016, that a lot of what Russia was doing was less about trying to get someone to vote for a particular candidate and more about creating chaos around democracy itself, around the democratic process. And we kind of have no shortage of that now, not just in the United Kingdom, but in other Western countries. And I think that's where there's a lot of potential, actually, for often small amounts of money and or very, very sophisticated political operatives to have a very significant impact on a political event.
So you mentioned other Western countries there. So immediately perhaps springing to my mind are organizations like the AfD in Germany and so on. Are there particular areas in Europe you might point to? I know it's not necessarily your area of expertise, but just while we're on the topic.
Well, I think it is. It's, you've got the march of the right in Europe. If you look at the Front National, I know they've renamed themselves. I can't actually remember what Marine Le Pen's new name for the Front National is. They have had significant bank accounts with Russian banks with significant overdrafts. We know that Matteo Salvini and the Lega took significant amounts of money from Russia. We have the AfD they've had a couple of funding scandals, and their position on Russia is incredible, frankly, incredible, to a point that you cannot believe it's credible were it not having some sort of financial relationship. And you can see this across the piece. Viktor Orban in Hungary, the impact of both actual direct financial ties to Moscow, both for political parties, but also for the governing parties, and the relationship between political operatives is really quite stark, actually. And you can see, like, it's going to be grimly fascinating to see how that plays out. But there's a huge scope in especially in PR system countries, actually, oddly, that you can get people elected. We've seen actually some great reporting from people like Politico in Europe about this, and we've seen, and the AfD have at least one of their senior aides has been accused, I think, of spying for China. But there's a lot. There is significant, I think, space in Europe at the moment for this.
It's striking, isn't it, that in this sort of year of global elections, this topic doesn't seem to be being treated with certainly the seriousness that I think the electorate should be demanding. And one, again, striking point that I would point to is that after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in the UK, there was considerable effort to kind of advance new laws on financial crime and property ownership and so on. But at the same time, there was an attempt to advance legislation in the elections world, but yet that was kind of overruled by the government. So can we just talk a little bit about that? Just remind us what happened there.
Well, it's in many respects it's absolutely remarkable, Tom. So in March of 2022, we had the tanks went into Ukraine, and very quickly Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister, and Dominic Raab, who's then Justice Secretary, and others, all came out saying, like, Londongrad is over, basically. We have to stop this. No one wants to talk about their own role in facilitating this, but we have to stop this terrible thing. And these big houses in the west end of London are bought by oligarchs through shell companies, etc. This all has to stop. And what's really striking about that, and a couple of areas where I'm interested in, one is around the whole enabling world, which you and others have written on, the whole issue of slaps and lawsuits against journalists and lawsuits to suppress free speech and to suppress public interest stories about kleptocracy. That really massively ran into the sand. Yes, there was some bits in the economic crime bill, but really in many respects that's ran into the sand. But even more significant for someone like me, I think, from a democracy standpoint, is at the same time the government brought in its Elections Act and its Elections Bill, which has effectively taken away the independence of the regulator, of the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission is effectively no longer fully independent. They answer to Parliament, and they've got less powers to deal with things like dirty money in politics. The amount you can give anonymously to British politics was increased by 40%. The way in which money is allocated by parties and can be, we used to have spending caps in constituencies, that's effectively gone. You can spend money as you want. You can give much more money anonymously than you ever could before. And so while we're talking tough on these things, we actually have done we've gone backwards in terms of transparency about where political funding is coming from and how political access can be bought and traded in the UK, which I find it is on one level absolutely phenomenal. And we know that over time, over the last 20 years, we had this huge infiltration. We know the great example actually is this the golden visas. There was a golden visa report, which for my sins I spent the last 3 years trying to get hold of. The Home Office, after Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, decided we're going to have an investigation to golden visas. This is where you're able to effectively buy a visa and effectively buy citizenship over time in Britain. Lots of rich Russians took advantage of it, as actually a lot of rich Chinese, basically Chinese and Russian money. The government says, we have to do something. Something must be done about this thing that we have facilitated for 15 years. A report is commissioned, and as far as I can gather, I'm still in an ongoing battle to actually try and get the government, the Home Office, to say whether the report exists or not. They're saying, well, there's nothing that's actually a formal report, but we don't know about this. We don't actually know what's happened. And I think this is the reality, unfortunately, behind the rhetoric. And a lot of these people who've been caught up on it were either politically exposed people or people with close links both to government in Moscow, but also good links into Westminster, because that's how it works.
So just to back up on some of the failings, only because I want to use a great quote that you provided, which is that Britain's electoral law contains loopholes so large you could see them from space. So what are the key things that people should be concerned about? What are the loopholes that we should be demanding get closed?
Well, some are just so absolutely like baffling. So one good example is you cannot give money if you're a foreign. We do not take foreign donations. You have to be on the electoral roll in the UK. But you can set up a shell company in the UK, which anyone can do online. It costs about £14, takes about an hour. And you can then make donations into a British political party through that mechanism, and that's totally legal.
So just to be clear, but that shell company is not on the electoral roll.
No, the shell company's not. The shell company it just has to be. It has to be on
registered company's house.
company's house, which anyone can do. In theory, you're supposed to show that you're trading. I've written so many stories. I did another one very recently on money to Robert Jenrick from a non-trading company. There's nothing done about non-trading companies, and some of these companies are really hard to find details on. To find, the last I did one recently about a company that ends up in Monrovia in Liberia, and that's able to donate to a political party in Britain, which is absolutely crazy. So that's one example of this. I think, but more generally, the extent to which you're able to anonymously donate, given the nature of how British politics works and what we know about what small amounts of money can buy. So the new electoral laws that were brought in at the tail end of last year mean that it's now for each person you can donate up to £11,800 anonymously. It's not uncommon for donors to donate through their families. So your wife, your husband, your 2 kids. That basically means you can give about £50,000 anonymously, which is a seriously amount of money. To go back to our leaders group, you're pretty close to being able to sit at the table. If you put some money in your dog's name, you can get there. So there's that as well. There's also kind of one of the biggest issues is what's called unincorporated associations. And so an unincorporated association sounds like quite a grand thing. It really is a kind of it's a legal description for an entity that has no corporate structure. So we could set up an unincorporated association right now together. Me and you, Tom, we want to clean up British politics, unincorporated association. Right now, we could start writing checks for British parties, sending it in. There's no register, there's supposed to be registers, never maintained, of unincorporated associations. I think the last donation that was registered to an unincorporated association was in 2014. Last year, they gave about £5 million to parties through unincorporated associations. So you can see the difference. There's a huge mismatch between, was this all small donations? So it's another area where there's large volumes of money go through these unincorporated associations into parties, into politics, and we cannot trace where that money comes from. And we're getting to the stage now where a really significant chunk of the money that funds parties, and probably more importantly, a really significant chunk of the bit that funds kind of critical events, whether it's elections, that funds like kind of critical moments, is coming in ways that we can't see. And similarly, you can also, actually probably the easiest, if you want to influence politics, Gutto Bebb, the former Wales minister, said to me when I was interviewing for my book, he said, if I was wanted to influence politics in Britain, I wouldn't give money to a political party, I'd give it to a think tank. And there's a lot of think tanks in Britain who don't declare their donors. They have incredible amounts of media reach. What's called Tufton Street, organisations like, for example, the Institute of Economic Affairs, in its last company accounts, says it has more than 5,000 media hits in the previous year. That's a humongous amount of media coverage. And no one knows, you don't have to declare where that money comes from. So there's other ways to influence the political sphere as well, beyond just the electoral politics. And we saw that actually with the election of Liz Truss in some ways. She was very much seen, like Tim Montgomery, the former Conservative advisor, said that she'd been incubated by the Institute of Economic Affairs. And so it's quite interesting in that context. Who's been funding the incubation is unclear because no money is declared.
So we'll come back to think tanks because we should obviously scrutinise ourselves. But I think one of the things I take away from what you're saying, though, is actually a lot of what we're talking about is not necessarily illegal or criminal action. It is basically smart use of an existing system, and we should be calling for that existing system to be tightened up. That's a fair summary.
Yeah, I think it is. There's lots. It's not that hard. Like there's a series of different things happening, and if you on one level, if you think about state threats are real, but also if you have a system like this that's so broken, it's so easy to abuse it. The old party parliamentary system is a all-party parliamentary groups. APPGs in layman's terms. They have been long known as a complete backdoor into lobbying. There's been some changes recently which should help, hopefully. But we've known that states have used these to lobby for years, and they're cheap at half the price. They're so easy. We've had a number of scandals around APPGs over the years, especially with foreign states. And so sometimes when you're talking about these things, they can sound quite dry and technical and just about little changes to things like laws and rules. But they both have an impact in terms of what political donors can do and how much influence they can have in a political process. But also, I think for external states, when you have a system which is so porous as this, it becomes much more easy to kind of take it, to abuse it.
So I want to come back to think tanks, because one of the things you've written about a lot is, if you like, the kind of Americanization of think tanks in the UK. So again, what should we be looking for there? You've talked about Tufton Street. You've written about that extensively. What are the things you'd point to there that we should be alert to?
Yeah, so I talk about it because what happened in America, and what's so interesting is, in America, think tanks became, from the 70s on, became such a big part of like kind of influence operations. They became almost like kind of like third wheels of political parties. And think tanks had always existed. I write about the Brookings Institution and others. There's a long history of think tanks, similarly in London. But what you saw was a kind of move towards more political think tanks, more overtly political think tanks. And it's quite fascinating, actually, with this election coming up. We have Labour Together, which is Morgan McSweeney's think tank, which has actually declared itself as a political think tank and is laterally declaring donations. It hadn't. It didn't declare £700,000 worth of donations at the start, but is laterally declaring donations and is registered as a third party in the electoral for the election. That hasn't been what we've seen in Britain for the last few years. We saw think tanks that are kind of on an American model, very political, very politicized, very involved in politics, involved in people like the rise of Liz Truss, but actually not declaring any donations because they don't have to, register charities, and be able to affect the political process because of that. Because it's a bit like that thing, again, where if you have a slightly element of plausible deniability and you can kind of say, look, we are independent, we do this thing, no one really asks you that question, like how independent, like who's paying for this, where is this funding coming from? And that's a very kind of American model, and it proved so successful in America. It was massively successful, and it still is if you look at what's happening even now in the Trump era. And so I think we've seen a big increase. I looked at their company accounts recently, like Tufton Street think tanks have all grown about threefold in the last 10 years in terms of turnover. So you're seeing money is clearly coming through. These organisations are having a much higher public profile. Rishi Sunak recently gave a kind of yet another reboot speech. It was at Policy Exchange. There's a huge nexus between the Conservative Party and these think tanks, and yet it does allow a way to influence the political process in ways that are very hard to track.
So for those living outside the London bubble, Tufton Street is a street in London where a number of these organisations aggregate. Now, another important topic that you write about is kind of the rise of technology and social media and how that has kind of gone hand in hand with the greater use of dark money. We're approaching an election at some date here in the UK in the months ahead. How should we be thinking about, and I suppose protecting ourselves against the rise of disinformation when we think about the election that's coming up?
It's interesting. It feels a bit like when we were talking earlier as well about this kind of this sense in which like stuff is happening in Europe and we're not really talking about it. It similarly feels about, like, I'm struggling to see where this conversation has moved since, say, 2019. It feels like an aftermath of the Trump election in particular, and this, all the stuff we knew about the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, the Russian bot farms run out of St. Petersburg. There was a lot of concern and talk about this. We had the Cambridge Analytica scandal as well. And it feels like actually almost no one's talking about these kind of issues at the moment. And in terms of what we can tell about it, we're actually no further. On the back of that scandal, Facebook brought in an ad library, so you can tell what ads are running on Facebook. It's pretty good. People still use it a bit. Google publishes some information, but after that, it's a real black box. And at the same time, the internet has changed massively. Where people get their information from has changed massively. Like the rise of things like Telegram, where a lot of people are getting their information direct on Telegram, the rise of other apps like Snapchat and TikTok, etc. And it feels to me there's a lot less traceability of where political messaging is coming from and where it's going than there was even 5 years ago. And actually, in terms of what we know, all we know is from the last battle. We know some information from the last war. We can tell, and often I think my sense is it's like Facebook ads are probably something the political parties are spending money on because they don't know what to spend money on. Like, someone gives you a chunk of cash. Like that's what the Lib Dems did. The Lib Dems got like £7 million from under Sainsbury's, or 8 million, which is a huge donation just before the last general election. And they bought loads of Facebook ads. They didn't do them any good. Like I think they lost a couple of seats. So it's become, I think, the kind of go-to thing for like political parties and politicians in that way that don't really know, aren't smart, and don't really know what modern campaigning looks like. Meantime, a lot of that stuff is happening off the books. There's a lot happening that we cannot trace. So I think it is still very much a wild west out there. We know that political, ad hoc political consultancies will do things like search engine optimization for you. We know that they'll do things like seed narratives for you. They can do all this stuff. AI again is changing the amount that you can do, replication, etc. And yet, in terms of the reporting you're going to see in the next few months about the online election, I think you're going to see a lot of stories about how much Rishi Sunak has, how much the Conservatives have paid Facebook ads on Rishi Sunak, and I think it's going to tell you very little about what's happening beneath the surface.
So one of the things I wanted to explore a little bit is that we're familiar with like the billboards and the TV advertising and so on, which I guess is controlled to a great extent. Is that the same when it comes to social media advertising? Is there the same control over that, particularly if it's coming from sources that are offshore?
Well, this is the thing. It's very hard to, outside of like what you've ended up with is a kind of like an official place like the Facebook ad library that's telling you, here's pictures, you can see what the imprints are, you can see what the different ads look like. They'll move pretty quickly, you can see all of that. But in terms of what's happening beyond that, it's almost impossible to trace at the moment. It's happening, it's happening in an incredibly unregulated way. You're not able to see, it's really hard to tell how conversations have been managed and manipulated. It's really easy to manipulate conversations. The things that have happened in places like Twitter, the reality is it's much worse now than it was in 2019. Some of those kind of community safeguards that happen in spaces like Twitter are totally gone. We've seen investigations that show how someone like TikTok, how people can be paid influencers, how foreign states can pay influencers. We know that happens. But in terms of tracing that, the internet's turning, it's such a complete wild west, and there's so little regulation around this, and the platforms have almost no regulatory accountability, so they don't really do very much.
So I want to spend a moment talking about the Electoral Commission, because at least in my mind, that is kind of the bulwark that we should be expecting to kind of uphold standards and so on and so forth in the UK. But you alluded to earlier in the conversation that it has had its wings clipped. So can we just explore that a bit? Because certainly the data and the information you see on the Electoral Commission website does not point to a good picture of public trust in politics. So what's happened to the Electoral Commission, and what should happen to it if it's going to do its job properly?
Well, I guess the long and the short of it is what happened to the Electoral Commission was Brexit, frankly. So what happened after the Brexit referendum was, and I was somebody who was doing a lot of investigations into this, it was quite a big story. I remember it was probably the biggest story in regards to this that I did on this was I'd sent freedom of information request to the Electoral Commission not long after Brexit around a campaigner called Darren Grimes, who people might have heard of now, who was not very well known at the time as a student. He's now got a show on GB News, I think. And he'd spent huge amounts of money, like something like £650,000 in the last few days of the referendum, which is very strange. And he'd been working as an organiser for Vote Leave. And I FOI'd the Electoral Commission because they had decided not to investigate this. So I just kind of FOI'd my colleague Jenna did actually. We wrote a story about it and internally the Electoral Commission were saying, this is really strange. We should investigate it, but let's not do that because it's so politically sensitive. And then that story went out and it caused a big kerfuffle. And eventually they did investigate Vote Leave and investigated Darren Grimes, and they found a series of breaches of electoral law. And that put them in the crosshairs of the kind of Brexiteers on the backbench of the Conservative Party in a big, big way. From being seen as a kind of small regulator that wasn't all that talked about or thought of, you saw endless column inches, particularly in the Conservative press, about the Electoral Commission, how awful it was. There was, at one stage, Amanda Milling, who was the then co-chair of the Conservative Party, wrote a kind of think piece for the Telegraph about abolishing the Electoral Commission. So that was the state of play. And in that climate, the government decided we needed to do something about elections. We need a new elections bill. And in that climate, the Electoral Commission not being disbanded almost became the bar of success, which is what it did become. And that was the bill that bequeathed voter ID, which is something the Electoral Commission were very much against, had warned that this wasn't a real problem. There was so little incidence of it. It was kind of tilting at windmills stuff. But in that context of that elections bill that became the Elections Act took a lot of powers away from the Electoral Commission. It took a lot of oversight powers away from it. It basically put it onto the executive to set the priorities for the Electoral Commission rather than the Electoral Commission setting its own priorities. It made it much harder and frankly politically anyway less likely that the Electoral Commission would do things like launch investigations in the way it had done into the Brexit referendum. And at the same time we've seen, but also put voter ID, which is quite cumbersome, expensive thing for the Electoral Commission to do onto the Electoral Commission. And at the same time, it kind of made it much like it made it much less likely that the Electoral Commission would actually be able to act, because frankly the government hasn't stopped or in any way listening to the Commission. So, which is a real problem. If you've got a regulator, we have these, that is how we regulate our liberal democracies. And if you create an electoral regulator and they say, guys, you've got a problem here. And actually a good example of this is one of the issues we talked about at the start of this, which is companies donating to politics. The Electoral Commission has been on the record upteen times saying companies shouldn't be allowed to give more to politics than they make in profits in the UK. Seems sensible. Stop using a shell company. That was never brought in. And if you look, you can see it from the Commission on Standards in Public Life. They've made a series of recommendations time and again around closing things like unincorporated associations. The government did none of those things. Instead, it brought in a lot of changes that were not wanted from the kind of electoral transparency democracy space, but arguably suited government agendas.
I mean, one of the things that I find striking is, we are a defence and security think tank, but we find ourselves engaging in this conversation more and more. And partly it's because some of the loudest voices in Parliament are actually from the security community. If you look at people like Lord Carlisle, for example, I mean, former counter-terrorism legislation reviewer, there is somebody who is very passionate on the need for reform. So to sort of bring things to a close, and assuming that we will continue to have the model that we have in the UK, so we're not going to go to sort of state-funded election campaigns and all the rest of it. If we had the shadow cabinet sitting in the room here with us, what would be the recommendations you'd be making to them about how we try and use this moment to restore trust in politics, particularly trust in the funding of politics, political campaigns and the like?
Well, in some ways, the crazy thing is all of it's out there, frankly. Almost all of it is already out there. And we have a system of government where we use parliamentary committees, we use para-parliamentary bodies to make representations and recommendations to the executive with the assumption that if they are good recommendations and representations, the executive will take them on board. It's kind of how our parliamentary democracy works. That's supposed to be its robustness. What we've seen time and again, and especially since 2010, is that recommendations that have got to do with issues like this, issues of democracy, issues of elections, and issues of political transparency, have not been taken on board. The Commission on Standards in Public Life, chaired by Lord Evans, made a series of very strong recommendations just a couple of years ago. The government, as far as I can gather, took almost none of them on board. They made previous recommendations, and so take this example of the recent increase in the amount of money you can give anonymously. That was justified by inflation. We haven't increased this for 20 years since inflation. The Commission on Standards in Public Life 10 years ago said that it's too high. The anonymous donation level is too high. So if you're a government minister at that point, you look at it and go, okay, well, yes, we have inflation, but actually we've already been told it's too high. So we might leave it alone. We're not going to increase it. But the executive, on an issue that shouldn't be a kind of party political issue, have not taken on board those recommendations. Similarly, from the Public Administration Committee, the PAC Act, from other committees, there's a series of very good, robust recommendations that could and should be brought in, and they haven't been. And instead, we're in a situation where I can never get over this. The maximum fine for breaking electoral law in the UK is £20,000. We're currently watching Donald Trump, many of us in court in New York. The crime he is accused of is fundamentally about. It's a fundamental breach of election law. That's what he is accused of, and he is in court over this. That doesn't happen in Britain. It's actually impossible for that to happen in Britain. That's clearly that's not a good state of affairs.
So your message to the opposition when they're writing their manifesto is
go back. Is take what's already there. Take what's there. Take what's been produced on a cross-party basis already. This should not be a partisan issue. Address these issues. Address the unincorporated associations. Address the ability to give money through companies. Address. I think there's a lot of things you could do. Address these issues. Address the issues of being able to give money to think tanks who can then influence the political process. Start to unpick a lot of these things. You could go further. I would happily go further. I make some recommendations in my book. I think Elizabeth Warren, when she ran for president in 2020, was very strong on these issues in America. We could have caps on donations. I think that would be a good idea. Why should you give endless amounts of money to political parties. You could do things like incentivize small donations. You could match fund, or even more than match fund, small donations. You could make political membership of political parties VAT free. There's lots of creative solutions that I'd love to see the shadow cabinet take on board. At the very least, take on board what's already out there. If you want to be ambitious and you want to try and bring trust back to politics, take the money out of it.
And at a time when we face hostile states, state threats, you'd have thought that should be a priority in securing our democracy. Peter, thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Tom.
Pleasure.